Welcome. I'm Anton, and this is Soundboard, conversations on music, art, and our inner emotional worlds. A few months ago, my friend JD and I recorded a couple of test episodes, long before I had figured out the title, branding, and any aesthetic details that you'll be seeing in the future. I did have some technical difficulties, and I recorded some patches over the places where my piano demonstrations had poor audio quality. Other than that, these recordings were a lot of fun. I think the topics are worth sharing, and I'd say it was a successful first attempt. I hope you enjoy, and stay tuned for more. Welcome, everybody. I'm not sure what we're going to do yet. We have no script, but it's just two friends nerding about music. It's Anton and JD. What's up,
Yeah,
JD?
not much, man. I'm excited to nerd about music. I never get to nerd about music with anybody.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a special thing. It's a very niche thing, and hopefully everybody who listens to us has fun. And I'm sure we'll have fun doing this.
Yeah.
We'd settled on the topic for the day was just the idea of timing and rhythm. We had a friend in a Discord that we're part of, and there was a music channel, and there was this whole issue of timing. And the piece in question was that also popular Debussy piece, Claire de Lune. And yeah, this idea of pulse and wanting to find a pulse in music. I don't know. Any initial thoughts there?
Well, there's a lot of thoughts. I forget because I had that long reply. It was
Mhm.
all over the place, but I think people tend to get too locked in to the wrong goal almost. Or I find that a lot of times there's a sense that something isn't on beat even when it seems clear to me that the performer is very much um, uh, everything they're doing is in relationship to the beat. And there's also, especially with the example that you're talking about, like the quote unquote impressionist composers and things like that, even though they didn't like that name, I understand why they had that name because there's like the, it's a perfect example of we're often trained in our culture to view um, music as like a grid, and everything has to be faithful to this grid. And uh, Debussy and those type, Ravel and them, oftentimes they're not thinking about the grid. They are really like Monet putting lilies around the canvas and of like little water drops here and there of sound. And if you're thinking about where it fits in a grid, or if you're trying to define one, you might be able to come up with a complicated time signature that you can kind of cram the whole entire piece into sometimes. And I'm not sure necessarily if that's always the most intuitive way to um, come to grips with what you're hearing. Um, I think that's sort of where we were going with it.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I
Yeah.
think to give our listeners some frame of reference, I will just play a little bit of the piece in question. So we all know it goes something like, and so on. And yeah, you're right. There's I guess I like you said, historically impressionists didn't particularly like being called impressionist, but I think that label popped up because they were really interested in that more viscerally sensorial experience rather than something cerebral and calculated. But anytime you kind of put something on paper and you have to publish it, you have to confine it in this language for the sake of I don't know, communicating it. It's like you sort of, you and your audience or the trained musicians or whatever, you sort of agree upon these symbols that mean a certain thing just so that information can be efficiently transferred. But but there's a loss of something. There's a loss of that magic that comes. I think my favorite analogy is it's sort of like, a phone number is, it's in a 3 plus 3 plus 4 numerical combination rather than just a string of 10 numbers, because I don't know, visual organization is just something that human nature kind of clings onto. And I feel like, from the standpoint of evaluating like written music, that's kind of what the meter does. It organizes things in a way that's visually coherent for humans that like to see patterns, and it gives us something to hang on to. But usually that's not the end goal. It's more of it's like a stepping stone to get where you want to. In the case of Claire de Lune, it's a piece that benefits from a lot of spaciousness. And that's not to say we throw the pulse completely out of the window, but it really benefits from a kind of flexibility of how you approach the music.
So, it's important also, I think, for the audience to know that I'm coming at this from a very different perspective than maybe a lot of your students and
Mm-hmm.
yourself will be, because I'm not classically trained, so there's a lot that I'm ignorant about. But what's cool about that, I think, for the purpose of these discussions, is that I can sort of tell you what intuitively how a piece of music, intuitively from the perspective of a rather like a naive listener, how I make sense of it, and that could help inform, I think, your end. Because, for instance, you were just playing that, and I hear like a very loose like three,
Mm-hmm.
like dun 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 dun, dun, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
then there's different like subsets of three, like faster ones and slower ones in there, but the most important thing is it's just a suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you decided at any point to add more space or less space between phrases as you were playing, it would not have sounded wrong because of the way that tune is created. Like, it would have sounded just like a different expression of it,
Mm-hmm.
because it's almost like a sonic version of watching leaves fall to the ground or something, and they can
Mm-hmm.
fall faster, slower. Some are gonna go slower, some are gonna go faster, and purely from the naive perspective of a person who enjoys the music, it wouldn't have felt wrong to me if some of those notes got put closer together or spread further out because of how open that piece is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rather than frame it as you coming from an ignorant or naive background, maybe there's a difference. I prefer the language that sometimes, if there's one weakness within the classical music world, it's just, we've inherited so much of this tradition that we sometimes put, or maybe we frequently put, dogma over discovery. But maybe people that don't have the baggage of a classical training, it's like you're able to approach it from a place of discovery rather than all of this inherited dogma of like all the rules and the conventions in classical music.
That's a good point. I accept that. That's a good point.
But you're right. Like, it is really interesting once you take away any visual references, right? Like, if I erased all of my memory about Claire de Lune, I wouldn't know necessarily to count it in a 9/8, which is 9/8, which is its, the official key signature. But there is a vaguely triplet feel, like you said. Like there's a waltz.
Yeah,
Like if I sort of what's it?
yeah. It sounds like a.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm trying to
It
think.
sounds like leaves having a waltz, but a much more relaxed and loose waltz.
Yeah, I don't know. Let me just double check the melody here. Okay, but like, yeah, you could almost do something like that. Just
Mm-hmm.
improvising something. There's a little bit of a,
And
so there is an underlying pulse, but it's
it's
it's in its full effect. It's hidden. It's like it's for us to know
it,
that there's something that binds these notes together, but we can kind of, yeah, like find an organic manipulation of the space, like falling leaves.
yeah, it's just sort of suggested in there enough where you kind of feel that it's there, but you're not pinned down to it
Mm-hmm.
when you
Yeah.
play.
to
Yeah.
sort of to sort of highlight maybe the thing that our friend was looking for. And this isn't to like throw shade at him or anything. It was just, he was also approaching it probably from a place of his own subjective discovery, where he maybe he finds himself more comfortable thinking of a pulse that you can hang on to. So if I were to sort of restrain it into something like you said, like on a grid, and much more transparent about the one, two, well, let me count it as, it's a nine, but I'm going to count it as a compound three. So one and two and three and 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 so on. And it's not to say that,
That's
yeah, but you kind of
that.
feel that it's for lack of a better word, it's more mechanical. And I don't mean to make that a value judgment necessarily, but it does change the feeling when you're sort of more metronomic about it.
Right. And that one and that is already kind of see. That's like it's there, even if you're not super faithful to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, like it's just so present in the way it sort of unfolds that even when you play it more expressively, loosely, however you say, like it's implied.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I do think like oftentimes we're kind of programmed or conditioned with the idea that, well, if that's what it is, you have to stay on it. And
Mm-hmm.
then you lose the magic of that beat.
Yeah, for sure. Let me like approach that again, but with this time with a kind of flexible and expressive counting. Like if we were to, I like to think of rhythm and pulse as if it does reflect that, if we can take that potentially mechanical aspect in music, um, the meter, so to speak, but turn it into something more human, just the same way that our heartbeat can, increase and
Mm,
decrease with whatever external stimuli we're facing or emotional stimuli. And then there's a sort of organic acceleration or deceleration. And we can apply that to how
mhm,
we handle pulse in something like this. Like, if I'm going again, one and two and three and 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 you can,
mhm.
there's a multitude of ways to approach it. I'm just sort of thinking off the cuff, but you can push and pull, and that comes from a lot of different things. How you're reacting to your instrument, how you're reacting to your instrument in a particular acoustic space, and how resonant everything is around you. And then it could also just be about the harmonic colors that you're sort of picking up, and yeah, kind of being available to the moment. It reflects kind of like, yeah, how our heartbeat, if we're taking a jog, or if we see someone we love, or our dog is running up against us, or we're kind of lying down taking in the sun in the beach or something like that. Like our heartbeat will kind of change to reflect those different experiences.
Yeah. The breeze changes speeds while you're
Mm-hmm.
sitting there. There is some sort of a breeze that's roughly coming at this level of, direction and pace, but it waffles and waves, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
and that's what makes it a breeze rather than a fan.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we've definitely been talking about rhythm and tempo in a piece that's really dreamy and spacious and expressive, like Claire de Lune. But our experiences of rhythm might be different if we're I don't know, we're encountering something that is meant to be more, I'm not going to say rigid, but I'm going to say like sharp and crisp. Like if we're
Yeah.
listening to like a tango or a hard swing, then we are going to depend much more on regular beats, so that anytime you're off the beat, that those syncopations have a kind of punch. So I don't have anything off the top of my head that I can play in terms of a faster swing or tango thing, but let me see if I can pull something up. I'm thinking of maybe a Piazzolla thing, but obviously the feeling of pulse and rhythm is also very context dependent, and there are times that it's reasonable and even like just like, not to get dogmatic about it, but it's correct or right to just feel a certain like edge to the rhythm. It might be, yeah, a certain piece. I don't know, what are your initial thoughts there?
Well, yeah, I mean, now if we're going to more like overtly rhythmic music with a much more overt like beat, we can also start exploring, whereas we were just sort of talking about a piece where the actual pacing is being set by the piano, which
Mm-hmm.
is being loose with its pacing. And now we're going over to the idea of music that does have a very steady, um, obvious pace and pattern to it.
Mm-hmm.
And then what do the musicians or performers on top of that, um, how faithful do they need to be to that? And from the perspective of a rapper, which is what I've been doing for a very long time, like just it's like one of my hobbies. But and also just I'm a fan, and a jazz fan. Um, if you listen to a rapper or a like nowadays, I find that a lot of the people's idea of like really good rapping is all super, super locked in to the grid of the beat, as well as on a lyrical level, locked into the grid of a syllable pattern. I find that boring. I have always gravitated towards people who will leave the grid when they flow, like a jazz musician, like a horn player, will leave the grid when he's you know but there's always a consciousness of where the beat is,
Mm-hmm.
but the beat might be chugging along like this, and a soloist, because whether you're a trumpet player or a rapper or whatever, or singer, you're kind of like a soloist. And um, the soloist is depending on what they're trying to paint, they're painting contours. So they might go slower for a minute or faster for a minute. They might leave a lot of open space for a moment. Um, and it's all to create these beautiful this line work
Mm-hmm.
around like if you have the big chunks of a scaffolding of a structure, which is like the underlying arrangement or beat, the soloist gets to paint like beautiful line work around it, like a butterfly. And I think it's good to remind people that, especially in this day and age where everything is computerized and everything, that um, there's real value in like in freeing yourself from the grid while you're performing over the grid.
That's a really good point for sure. It kind of reminds me. I don't remember who. Hmm. All right. If anybody wants to fact check me on this, feel free. If there's ever anybody in the comment section, but I want to say it was the famous, um, like pianist pedagogue Rosina Levine. She was like an early to mid 20th century teacher, really famous. Among her great students is Van Cliburn, who won the Tchaikovsky competition in the 19 late 50s or early 60s. Anyway, Rosina Levine said this thing about, because I think she had noticed a lot of her students. I think we're doing exactly what you said, that where they felt so maybe square and confined to the grid. And I think she made a comment about modern architecture just being like these symmetrical boxes, and they weren't used to like those, like I don't know, the legs of a table or a chair where they're like hand carved and they have all these spirals and these details.
Exactly.
And I think it is an aesthetic value too that I think we've started to favor. I mean, I'm not knocking that because I have a soft spot for like IKEA stuff and Scandinavian minimalism. Like it has its own beauty and
Hmm.
I love it too. But I also understand that maybe as a generation we're not as sensitive to like those like I don't even like the handle of like an umbrella that might have like an eagle's head that's like hand carved into the wood. All of these details that aren't perfectly symmetrical.
But let's take that like really let's take the like the IKEA furniture or like brutalism architecture, which I actually really like some brutalism, and I think it just I think brutalism still has a lot of potential in it for its
Mm-hmm.
own thing, but it's not necessarily my favorite, but I still like it. I think there's value to it. Or like the IKEA stuff that you're talking about. Anything that's very hard edged and let's say you have a piece of IKEA furniture in in your apartment, um, and you put a pothos plant next to it, or you hang a pothos plant off of a very or, or different kinds of ivy and stuff and vines, you grow them on a very rigid building, right? Um, that's sort of to me what the line work or the soloist or something can provide the underlying architecture of the music.
Hmm.
Is like a plant, like a pothos or a vine or something like that isn't going to be rigid, even though the thing that it's sitting on is rigid.
Yeah, yeah. There's this interplay of like, yeah, the structure of the thing, and then like the if I'm getting the visuals correctly, it's like the vine that wraps around the existing structure, and it's like this
Yeah,
juxtaposition of the of something more organic and something that's almost like offering like you said a scaffolding or a skeletal structure or something.
yeah, and that sort of that marriage of neatness and messiness, for lack of a better word, I think that's generally what really makes something really pop and come alive, whether it's in visual art or music.
Yeah, I completely agree too. It's probably Jordan Peterson who's very fond of saying something something substrata something something the interplay of order and chaos. So I'm probably borrowing from him, but it is that I think in music and art it is that interplay between order and chaos because we need like speaking in music we need some kind of consistent rhythm as a frame of reference. We need melodies and scales that make sense in a particular cultural context. Like for us, in the Western music, it's going to be whatever variations of major and minor and some other things, and then expand that to jazz. We need blues scales or bebop scales, like things that are sort of in the culture, and it's something we can reference. But if everything is so predictable and we know where the music is going, it sort of just it's not exciting. It's elevator music at best, and I'm not that sounds so elitist, but maybe it doesn't inspire quite as much. It could be pleasant to listen to, but it's maybe vanilla. Well, I remember learning in like music theory class, like in very broad terms, like all of the fancy language. Really, you can boil it down to certain patterns that like music likes to establish expectations and then play with them. Sometimes you fulfill those expectations, and sometimes you take them in a completely different direction and surprise your listener. And I think same thing with visual art, whether it's an unexpected pop of color or the
Yeah,
juxtaposition of like something beautiful and harmonious with something really shocking and maybe grotesque. And it is that like the bouncing back and forth between two things that seem opposite, but maybe it's better to think of them as like complementary. And I think that reflects our
absolutely.
own like human experience where we're really not just one thing or the other. It's the bouncing back and forth between the order and the chaos.
Yeah, and I think there are different ratios of order and chaos that can work really well in different contexts. One thing that we have both discussed frustrates us in some of the circles that we find ourselves in is the overemphasis on order. So much of what makes life feel alive is some of that disorder. And at the same time, as fun as free jazz is to listen to, I don't think there's too many people who that's all they could ever listen to because the expectations and the order and the grounding in something is generally needed to produce the sense of floating up above the ground. You need to
Hmm.
have you know, the sense.
Yes, the
Yeah,
ground. That's a really beautiful image. Yeah, I it
yeah,
one of my undergrad theory teacher's favorite metaphors was yeah, going back to the Homeric epics of Odysseus leaving home, and if our sense of order and structure is home, but like everything else, the disorder, so to speak, the excitement, the adventure it comes from leaving home, and it's like you need home and the ability to leave home for home to have any
y-
meaning. Because if you're always
well
stuck at
said,
home,
well said.
yeah. And yeah, that's
Yeah.
kind of one of the if we ever get around to like talking about like, the one of the biggest things in classical music is sonata form. And in summary, there's a whole bunch of like fancy schmancy like theory language you could use to discuss, sonatas. But fundamentally what sonatas are is like you establish like your home base and you take your listener far away from home base, and in what we call the development section, that's where you create a lot of excitement and tension and sometimes that's where you put the dramatic climax, but then at some point you bring them back home, and that's what really gives sonatas their dramatic structure. It is about giving your listeners a sense of where home is and taking them. Someone like Beethoven would was notorious for taking people far away from home and into places that they wouldn't have expected, especially for, for the ears of his day that weren't accustomed to that level of departure.
That's someone I would love for you to help me to appreciate.
Yeah, Beethoven. All right, I'll put that on the
Yeah.
list. Um,
Mhm.
Fun fact for the classical music history nerds out there. Yeah, 2027 is going to be Beethoven's 200th death anniversary. So I
Oh,
imagine, like
wow.
in the classical music world, there'll be some events commemorating that. And I haven't played much Beethoven at all in the last few years, but since his 200th death anniversary is coming up, I'm sort of going to use that as an excuse to maybe either relearn stuff that I've already played or maybe look at some new stuff. So yeah, it would be really cool. We should definitely dig into
Yeah,
it.
because I am a casual fan of classical music in the
Hmm.
same way that and I've been, approaching it in the same way that I approach most things that I fall in love with is sort of in my own way, like going into the cave and just digging around and seeing what I find
Hmm.
and suddenly being like, "Ooh, I like this. Ooh, I really like these impressionist composers or whatever." Then I hit some that everybody like raves about and I don't fully get it.
Hmm.
And Beethoven has been one that obviously I'm not saying that he wasn't amazing because I'm absolutely confident he was amazing. It just
Hmm.
hasn't clicked for me yet.
No worries.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to take you on that journey because Beethoven was,
Okay.
yeah, especially late high school, early undergrad. Like I think that's when there was a fire lit in me, and I just like I totally got it, and I yeah, no, Beethoven would be a really fun one to dig into.
I'm
Like
with
you're
you on
open to,
Chopin. Like
yeah,
Chopin,
Chopin.
like I get.
Hmm.
Yeah. Mozart and Beethoven are two that like I have not figured it out.
It's
Yeah.
cool that like you're open to that sense of discovery, but it also it's a good opportunity for me that's been immersed in this stuff forever. It's just like to break it down and to really put into words and something sensible and to sort of maybe help you find a roadmap into to getting into their yeah to getting into their headspace and what they were thinking and what they were feeling.
Okay, yeah, that'd be
Yeah,
cool.
and same thing with like I guess like the mirror image of that is I'm a casual listener of like jazz, rap, and hip hop and stuff, and it's like because it's like it's such a different world, and I haven't. I'm also just sort of like I'll wherever the algorithm takes me or whoever recommends something, I'll sort of slowly explore these things, but I don't have sufficient like cultural references or an understanding of the context that inspired these various lyricists and where certain rhythms may have been influential on each other and stuff. It's just yeah, I think that's
Sometimes like
really
kind of like this order and chaos thing that we were talking about. Like
mhm,
I think on one level it's great to just discover things in your own way and find how a piece of art or music genuinely hits you
mhm,
before being told what you're supposed to think about it. But then on the other hand, when you're at a point where you're not sure how to make heads or tails of something, but everybody is saying this is really good
mhm,
or something, then it's also great to like hear from somebody who really loves a piece of music or art or style or whatever, who can explain to you what it is about it that they find appealing. And then sometimes that's where you're able to, oh, I see why that's appealing.
mhm.
I kind of hear that now. I wasn't hearing that before, but now I hear it. So
Yeah,
I would love to do that for you as well, like with the jazz and the hip hop. And me right now, it's been the winter, so I've been in my cave of Bjork, just
yeah,
listening to
hundred
all this
percent.
Bjork. Yeah.
That's also definitely like a breadcrumb we should leave for people who check us out. It's just like we are gonna do at least one or two breakdowns of some of your hits of like Björk, and then yeah, with that discussion, you can certainly take the lead because that is absolutely that's your domain, and I'm also in a place of discovery and making sense of that, and like dissecting all the sounds and the atmosphere and the decisions she makes that are effective.
You know, I would actually love to do a part two of this or something after you
Hmm.
hear a few things that I would send you. I knew that you wanted to have you brought this conversation up to me a couple days ago.
Hmm.
And then I was listening to the Björk song "Unravel." She has a lot of songs where people will say that she has a very tenuous sometimes relationship, it seems, with the pulse of like
Hmm.
the beat or whatever. And it's obviously intentional. But whereas, like, where I was talking about, there are times where somebody can be leaving the beat where you can totally tell, well, they're not really left the beat. They're hitting it in points where you're not expecting them to hit it. They might be
Mm-hmm.
dragging a little bit or rushing a little bit, but they're still very much weaving through it. Sometimes Björk goes even further than that, to where it's like, okay, what does this fit the definition now of truly offbeat, even if it's an artistic intention? And I think like the way she sings on Unravel is an
Mm-hmm.
example of really stretching that to its limit, but it sounds so good.
You know, that kind of reminds me of something that was kind of tying this into to Mozart, since you had mentioned that you were curious about Mozart, but because Björk is a singer, and then you're saying that she's like in relation to, the tracks that she composes, like her voice is what veers off the beat, if I'm understanding
Yeah,
correctly.
like she she
Mm-hmm.
she even says like she's even said in interviews like she's
Mm-hmm.
super meticulous when she's constructing her music. And then she's like the opposite when she's performing. She
Mm-hmm.
says her vocal performance is the one area where she gets rid of the scientists in her brain and goes full on like just free and feeling and all of that. And so um, she'll do things in her performances
Mm-hmm.
that people might think are wrong or a mistake, but it's actually what gives it so much flavor. And like she'll like stutter, like she's about to say something, and then she catches herself, and then she says it like a half second later,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. And but it's just so perfect. And then like in that song Unravel, she's all over the place with her relationship to the pulse, but you can still follow it. You can
Yeah.
still follow it, but you're like, okay, whoa, she really rushed ahead there. Oh, she really dragged behind there to the point where it almost sounds like, is her like earbud working? A person might, is her
Mm-hmm.
headphones working or something? But no, like it's like, is the monitor on? But it's actually just so dynamic.
Just to throw in some funny classical music terms, like the idea of rushing back or pulling back, and it's not just one direction. It's like she'll rush and then she'll drag, and a few things, like the technical term for
Yeah.
that is as rubato, which I think comes from an Italian word like to rob or steal time. So if you steal time by like taking it and slowing down, then at some point you give it back by rushing ahead. So that because if your
Yeah.
only expressive device is to keep slowing down, then at some point the music's going to grind to a halt. And on the flip side, if you're only rushing to create excitement, then at some point you're going to have nowhere to go. And it's knowing when to push and when to pull, so that it's like if you take the average of everything you're doing, you're still somewhat within that grid, so to speak. But it never feels that way because you're sensitive to like the moment you're in the music.
I remember you were telling me about that term, and I love that I now know the term for it because it is something that, like, with my own like rapping and stuff like that, that like I just love to do that. It's like one of my favorite parts of the whole concept of flow is that sort of stealing time and giving it back, slowing down, dragging, and then speeding it up, but not just like arbitrarily.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're doing it where sometimes you drag a word because of the way that word sounds and the
Mm-hmm.
way the music sounds against that word, and you want to really let a syllable ring out, or something you're saying is you want it to sound like molasses, and then
Mm-hmm.
like you're saying something else and you want to have that sense of urgency about it,
Yeah.
and and having that relationship between the two, you create these little contours like filigree on the top of a structure or something.
I'd mentioned Mozart a little bit, and I think it reminds me of this story because Mozart, although he's associated with very clean lines and pristine writing, and he's sort of like the embodiment of like the so-called like classical ideal in a way, but
Mhm.
it's actually one of the things. Well, one, I think we sometimes forget in history that like Mozart was one of the best improvisers of his day. I think sometimes classical music has taken itself so seriously, and particularly with regard to respecting the text, when we forget that some of the greatest composers were improvising, and at some point they had to submit something to a publisher. But specifically with Mozart, on the topic of timing, um, the funny irony is that pianists, one of the biggest thing that is sort of introduced very early on is learning how to coordinate the hands, like right and left. But Mozart had this thing which is often described as like his left hand was that grid, but his right hand was almost never perfectly in time with his left hand because the right hand was the singer in this context, and he would love those melodies to push forward or to hold back, so that the right hand was like sometimes it would line up with the left hand, sometimes it would be a bit ahead, sometimes it would be a bit behind. And that's actually that seemed to be common practice in a lot of earlier piano playing where things weren't perfectly uh, like on a grid. Maybe
Man,
it
that
ties
has to
into
be
like
so hard to do. That must be so hard to do with two hands.
I think it is. Although now I've kind of funnily my wife always pokes fun at the fact that now I have the opposite problem where I've gotten so used to it that my hands almost never sound like they're at the same time. Like I don't have
Oh, okay.
it's kind of funny. Let me think. I don't have any Mozart off the top of my head that I could play, but Chopin is quite similar, and Chopin was actually very influenced by Mozart. So I guess it's effective to like demonstrate with Chopin. Like let's take like this theme from his third sonata, and it's so that's like the left hand stuff. That's like the grid, right? And
Hmm.
let me try to be a good schoolboy and line everything up perfectly, and it would be something like that wasn't entirely perfect, but
Hmm.
more or less like it was again, it's on that grid. But if I try to
Hmm.
take a Mozart approach, which incidentally was also Chopin was also very fond of that idea of like the left hand is the foundation and the right hand should have the freedom to sort of weave in and out of times. And it's like it's a matter of sometimes if I really were to exaggerate, a lot of the time it's like maybe the bass comes a little bit before there, it maybe ascends faster. And like I'm kind of exaggerating now, but there's just a little break in time. It's not really intended to like draw attention to itself too much, but it's enough so that like you said, there's a freedom. It doesn't feel like it's like a 4x4 grid, and there's a little bit of an organic feeling. There's like
And so
the sense of the nature
Mozart,
path.
and so Mozart helped to bring that approach to the forefront.
Yeah, I would say
Wow.
I mean, at least he was one that was written about. Maybe people, maybe
Okay.
other
Okay.
composers were also doing things, but I associate that description with Mozart. And one reason was that Mozart was a big opera composer, and so he was always thinking about the human voice. And the thing is, like when we think of like how we speak and sing naturally, it's just it isn't symmetrical. It's anything but. It's free flowing, and I think the best way to approximate that on a piano, which is very like push button, is that you do have to play with time, and so things don't perfectly line up all the time. But that's where you get the organic sense.
I think you said the key. I mean, I felt this way for a very long time when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to music. I kind of think in so many ways, melody and music and everything like that is like a more artistic, glorified version of speech.
Absolutely.
The way, just the vocalizations of creatures, including human beings, the expressive vocalizations of creatures trying to communicate their whatever's inside that they're trying to express, that becomes music. And art and music in general, I think, is at its best when there's some connection with the things we find in nature. And that's interesting. He was perhaps kind of aware of that.
Speaking from my own observation experience, that at least the composers that I've always gravitated towards, they do think so much, just as you said, like the human voice and that inner expression. Like Mozart, big opera composer. Chopin didn't compose opera, but was a huge lover of opera, and so he was always trying to. He was sometimes falling in love with opera singers or trying to take what they were doing on stage and translate it to the piano. Rachmaninoff also big into to singing. I think his biggest influence is like Russian Orthodox chant, and maybe some
Mm,
folk material. A lot of composers and many more that I haven't named. It's like there's this recognition of the immediacy of the human voice, and like how can I take that same immediacy and raw expression and translate it to my instrument? Because yeah, you're right. Like whether we're using synths or keyboards or string instruments or percussion or whatever, it's basically taking what's in our inner musical voice, but just kind of exploring timbres and colors that are not natural to our human body. But it's like we
yeah.
find a way to approximate them, whether it's a guttural sound or a vocal sound or beatboxing or something. But then that's like the seed or the kernel of our idea, and then we have all these tools to see if we can explore more colors. But it does emerge, I think, from a vocalization of some kind.
And yeah, I feel like sort of the feeling that a given melody conveys to the average listener, if you were to map that melody on the inflections of somebody speaking, would convey a similar feeling. Like if you were to turn that melody into something a little more atonal and have somebody say a sentence in that cadence and going up and down in pitch, but maybe not exactly hitting those notes, I think you would arrive at a similar type of expression of feeling. Trying to think of a sentence that I can use as an example. Later on, I'm gonna go shoveling today. Right? That's sort of like, I don't know, resignation, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
that's kind of the same feeling versus like later on I'm gonna go shoveling today, and you're gonna add like when someone says it like that, later on I'm gonna go shoveling today, like you put that in a musical mode, you're expressing the same kind of thing. I don't know, there's an immediate instant like connection, I think. Like you're expressing a similar kind of feeling, and I think ultimately like everybody who speaks is a musician.
Yeah, you know what? That's a very good point. I mean, to if I were to broadly generalize those gestures, it's like sadness, resignation, melancholy tends to go downwards, and like the joyfulness or triumph tends to go upwards. Now that's like a really crude generalization because I'm sure there are
Yeah.
exceptions.
And then there's the like is your voice lilting?
Mm-hmm.
Is it like blaring? Is there
Mm-hmm.
a punch in the attack, or is there like a glide in the attack? And all of
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff is how we write melodies when we're trying to express the same kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good. And I can't think of well, I mean, I can't conjure it up in my fingers, but now that brings me to like the little jingles you hear in a video game when a character is defeated, and sometimes the melody or whatever will like you'll
Yeah.
think of like the trumpet like or
Yeah.
like a cartoon thing,
Dun,
and then
dun,
versus
dun, dun,
like
dun, dun, dun,
yeah,
dun.
or like maybe I'm thinking of like I don't know the Final Fantasy, like when you win a thing and it's like da 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 dan 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 da dan and it's like rising. Yeah,
Yeah.
like exactly like those little inflection points in our voice. It kind of gets reflected in music or these little moments in like video games, little jingles you hear.
Like if you're still trying to say something and you're not really being even you said in like the jingles you hear, and like with there was like a suggestion that there's more that could be
Mm-hmm.
said about it. Dun, 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 dun. That's like a sense of hang on, there's more coming,
Mm-hmm.
and you get that in music and in speech.
Yeah, no, for sure, man. Anyway, I think I got to wrap it up in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
You have any like closing thoughts before we
No, this was a fun icebreaker.
Mhm. Yeah, 100%, man. I was
Yeah.
as with everything, like starting is always the hardest, and sometimes I don't know
Uh-huh.
where it'll go. But I don't know. I think we've got it in us to like just have a lot of fun conversations, and we'll see where this project takes us. And
That would be fun.
hopefully we'll build an audience along the way. We'll find like minded nerds.
Yes, and let's send each other some on the private message. Let's send each other some examples of what we were talking about.
100%. Yeah, more conversation material and just more stuff to expand our worlds,
Yeah,
man. Yeah,
yeah,
this little project of
absolutely.
when worlds collide, uh, like a classical pianist and a master rapper get together in a room,
Yeah, man. Well, maybe someday I'll be like that.
All
But
right. Well, anyway, I
all
guess
right.
until next time, peace and love, y'all.
Take care, man.